We'll probably be going right now for tax reform, which we could have done earlier, but this really would have worked out better if we could have had some Democrat support. Remember this, we had no Democrat support, so now we're going to go for tax reform, which I've always liked.
President Trump turning his attention to taxes this afternoon after the Obamacare repeal and replace collapsed in the House. Trump's Treasury Secretary said today a tax overhaul will be an easier lift for Congress and that a plan will be released by the administration very soon. With us here tonight, Caitlin Huey-Burns of Real Clear Politics and our own Ali Velshi, about whom I have to say, you came here from tonight's showing of Hamilton.
Yeah.
So officially, you have seen the heights of democracy and welcome to the depths of democracy.
Yes, we've seen it all.
Give us a preview, because while it is not a catch-fire topic, tax reform is about to enter our vocabulary, and it's about to be sold to the kind folks watching tonight.
Yeah, it's really hard. I
when
think
you're
it's
saying
great.
that
I mean, it's great that Steve Mnuchin says it'll be an easier lift. Why he says that is because there's some parts of tax reform that have some bipartisan support. It tends to be that part which has to do with corporate taxes. You'll hear it said that America's got the highest corporate taxes in the developed world. It's not really true, because there are so many loopholes that we actually are not all that high, but they want to get it down lower to 15 to 20%. That's probably not possible, but it's the only area where they might get some Democratic support. The problem is when it comes to personal taxes, there's no agreement on whether they should be lower or higher and how that affects the deficit. So it may not be comprehensive tax reform, but there may be small incremental wins you can have. But you remember, Brian, this is hard. It doesn't happen that often.
And Caitlin, we will talk to actual Americans in the days and weeks and months to come. The president right now stands at 37%. We don't know if that if that's going to migrate north or south as a result of this. Do you think his base has no base as to their willingness to forgive and get on with things? And do you think this will be the next agenda? Tax reform, infrastructure, the southern border wall, and...
Well, the biggest question is, when do his supporters start to leave him? We've seen them be very loyal to him throughout this process. Extremely loyal. But he also promised a lot of deliverables. So a lot of this support, I think, hinges upon him being able to actually
This today may end up being an interesting pivot point into him realizing, wow, the hard right of the Republican Party is not going to be satisfied with concessions. There's some moderates here who might team up with some Republicans, and maybe we'll get some business done.
But did you hear him self-editing today? Because anytime he fears he's left himself open, he goes back. He said, we thought we could get this done earlier had we been able to get it done. And he also said that these factions predated his arrival in Washington.
Right, not my problem. I didn't start this.
Both sides like Trump.
Right.
So he's going to have to test.
So there's an interesting point that he made there when he said that comment. He had really liked tax reform more than health care, but health care takes so much off the deficit that it would have gotten them a kickstart to tax reform. Now they've got to cut more taxes or cut more spending in order to achieve what he wanted to achieve. So there was actually a strategic reason to want health care first. Without that, it actually makes tax reform a heavier lift than it would have been.
And Caitlin, dealing with all this as a breaking story today, have you had time to count up the tally, what this means, I should say the toll, what this has done to the administration today?
I think it is a major blow. There's no way else to describe it. Trump campaigned as the master negotiator, someone that could go in there and get things done. He said that he left everything on the field, on the table, but you know, he didn't really sell the merits of this law. He campaigned on, or sold it, pitched it in political terms, saying vote for this or else. You campaigned on repealing and replacing Obamacare. This is it. Didn't really convey to people why they should support what was in the law, the substance of the bill. And it was very unpopular. healthcare, as we were talking about before, is a very personal issue for people. People understand the basic nature of it.
Customers.
Customers, exactly.
Yeah.
Tax reform's a little bit different. There's a reason that, tax reform is not really a bumper sticker kind of thing in campaigns. Obamacare repeal and replace was. I think this is going to be hard for Trump in some ways. I think he might be more inclined to things like tax reform, but the marketing side of this is going to be a heavier lift. Getting people to really care, especially when it comes to the corporate side, which is what the markets want to see and what Trump wants to see.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare is emotional. Taxes are something corporate America wants to deal with. It's not that emotional.
Remember that you said that when we ask you to explain taxes again. Ali Velshi, who was tonight, to quote a great Broadway show, in the room where it happens. Caitlin Huey Burns was as well. Thank you both for doing so at the end of a momentous week and a momentous Friday. Coming up, the members of Congress who have such a high-stakes job and who they want to talk to next, provided they are still talking to each other when the 11th hour continues.
The committee will ask Director Comey and Admiral Rogers to appear in closed session and will postpone the previously scheduled March 28th hearing in order to make time available for Director Comey and Admiral Rogers.
I think this is a serious mistake. We welcome at any time bringing the former directors back in closed session. We don't welcome cutting off the public access to information when we have witnesses, as these three very important witnesses, who are willing and scheduled to testify in open session.
So that was House Intelligence Committee ranking member, the lead Democrat Adam Schiff, reacting to today's decision by the committee chairman, Devin Nunes, to cancel a public hearing next week. Nunes says the committee has more questions for the FBI director, the head of the NSA, that can only be answered in closed session. Schiff is suggesting the open hearing, which was supposed to include officials from the Obama administration, was canceled after pressure from the White House. Also today, we learned former Trump associate Paul Manafort and Roger Stone and Carter Page have all volunteered to be interviewed by the committee, but whether those interviews would be open or closed to the public is still TBA. Joining us tonight, former chief of staff at both the CIA and the Pentagon, also former counsel to the House Intelligence Committee, Jeremy Bash. Jeremy, you're our guy on this, especially on days when our attention is pulled somewhere else. How big a development was today? How big a deal does this investigation continue to be?
Good evening, Brian. Well, I go back to Devin Nunes' comment that it was his duty to run to the White House and inform the president of what he was learning, in effect tipping off the target, if you will, the titular target of the entire investigation. And remember, Nunes has really two roles here. He's not only leading one important investigation, he's also one of the few select members of Congress who are being briefed in real time by the FBI director about their investigation. So he has as much information as anybody does on the planet about this investigation, and he goes to the White House and tells the president everything he knows. And if you look at the statute that governs what is the role of the House Intelligence Committee, it's to be currently and fully informed of intelligence activities, to authorize those activities, and to conduct oversight over those activities. It's not to be a shill or a shield for the president. And so Nunes really compromised the integrity of the entire effort this week, and today's hearing cancellation, I think, only added to that.
On that front, we had the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, in this very room tonight talking to Rachel Maddow, and part of his comments here got our attention.
Nunes is way out of line and seems to be much more of an advocate for the administration, and this troubles me. We have had a bipartisan tradition on the intelligence committees, more than any other committees, you know, where you leave your politics at the door when you enter that briefing room, where no penetration, we call it a skiff, you know, no one can listen in. And I think Nunes is ruining that. And I hope, I've said this, I hope Speaker Ryan maybe appoints somebody else. He has so jaundiced his impartiality. He'd have to do a lot to recover, given how he's behaved.
Jeremy, I must say those are some of the same findings that you called out in real time the other day. But secondly, is there a chance that they will change horses in midstream, that Nunes is just going to be in an unprotected position?
No, I think the speaker will stick with him. But to go back, Brian, to this point about the hearing that he canceled. So they were supposed to have a hearing next week with John Brennan, the former CIA director, Jim Clapper, the former DNI, and Sally Yates, the former acting attorney general. Remember, Yates is the person who went to the White House counsel, Don McGahn, and said, look, we've got a problem with Mike Flynn. He's not telling the truth to the president. He said he did not discuss sanctions with the Russians. He did. And we now know from, you know, what we've understood here that McGahn told the president about this. And so Yates would have testified next week. In effect, I gave the president, through his counsel, a heads up about Mike Flynn, and that would have put Nunes and the White House and their allies in a very uncomfortable position next week, and that's, I think, why they canceled the hearing.
And you feel that no one's going to inadvertently blurt out secrets that shouldn't be best in closed session. You feel that generally sunshine and fresh air are best for an investigation this elemental to a new administration and this vast.
Yeah, these are professional people who have testified many times on classified and unclassified topics, and they're well trained. And I think you actually need both. You probably need much of it done in unclassified format and some of it done in a classified format. It should probably be, you know, those weightings, if you will. but you got to have both. But as something of this magnitude, the public needs to understand what the committee is doing. The committee is the eyes and the ears of the American public. If they don't do it, no one else will.
Well, there's a note to end our discussion on. Jeremy Bash, thank you so much for staying up with us on a Friday night and so ably covering this part of today's news, which is very, very important, Jeremy. Thanks. And coming up after our next break, we'll look back at just where we've been over the seeming eternity of this past week when the 11th hour continues. Defeat, the sharpest rebuke yet of Trump's young presidency and his negotiating skills, the question continued to nag at the president whether or not this was a good bill. Robert, are you too close to this? Is it too early to give us a damage assessment in your view?
Oh, it's a major political defeat for the president. Objectively speaking here as a reporter, this was something he embraced. He may not be an ideological and-style Republican, but he went along with the agenda from congressional Republicans. And as I spoke to the president, it was clear he thought he could adapt his deal-making skills from the real estate world to the political world. But what he recognized, and he revealed this over the course of the conversation, that the political world is far less transactional, and it's very different. You have purists here, ideologues, skittish moderates, all these different factions. And Trump said something I thought that was so telling. The president said, "I didn't realize," he told me, "there was all this anger and factional politics within the House GOP. It had little to do with Trump and more to do with the Freedom Caucus, the conservative wing battling with Speaker Ryan, and all of these dramas he had waded into that had been simmering for months, if not years."
But parts of his personality on full display today. The quote you just mentioned, later in the Oval Office, he talked about the two leading factions, GOP, but then caught himself and said both sides like Trump. And in your interview, such an interesting quote, he says, we were a little bit shy. Very little, but it was still a little bit shy, so we pulled it. It's not a tough walk here to see himself editing himself. Came close to admitting deficiency, something he doesn't do. So he said, you know, very little bit shy. In the end, who knows what the numbers would have been?
Well, our whip count, I think it was similar to NBC's, was about 36 Republicans, maybe a little less, were firmly opposed to the bill as a vote approached. And the president says that the speaker did come in and it was very frank and candid. And I said, are you frustrated with Ryan as a whip, as someone who was trying to put together the package? And he just kept saying, I don't blame Paul. I don't blame Paul. And I tried to kind of get something out of him. It was so unexpected. I said, well, you're 60 days in, Mr. President. What did you learn from all this? And he's not really a reflective person, I have to say, in the sense of really being wistful about a major political crisis. He just kind of flatly joked in a way, another day in paradise. And then I tried to draw him out more, and he said, take care.
I think you just became the first person to put the words Donald Trump and wistful into the same sentence. Robert, stand by. We're going to bring on our folks, Kelly O'Donnell, Chris Jansen. Kelly, watching you last night and others and reading everything I could, it looked like when they appealed to party and patriotism and emotion that this thing may have been headed to the upside. But then watching you all day, in a way it got worse. Was that because the bill became more onerous, more of a Christmas tree?
I think there was just a sense that there would not be satisfaction among those, especially in the Freedom Caucus, but also some moderates who were concerned about their constituents who wanted more of the Obamacare pieces to remain. So on both ends, there was a dissatisfaction, and it was almost as if that was getting stale through the day. Instead of sort of a team spirit, we can get this passed and then make additional changes and try and move the ball forward, it just started seeping out. It was great to hear Bob's discussion about how the president played this out, because I was also struck by the fact that Paul Ryan told us that he said to the president we should pull it, and the way that Bob just described it, the president took ownership for that deal. I'm not sure which one is quite right. I also will always now answer phones that have the caller blocked.
Yeah,
that is the lesson from this.
We're all making a note of that, including anything that comes in during the broadcast. Chris Jansing, at the other end of the street, the other end of Washington at the Trump White House. The president's comments from the Oval Office today, if you look at them in the rearview mirror, left us thinking, well, we're left with a disastrous health care system for the citizens of the United States. After all, that was the effort to try to fix this. Truth Squad this a little bit. How bad is it?
Well, I mean, let's just say I think that the reports of Obamacare's demise may be greatly exaggerated. There are problems. There's no doubt about that. You have a system where you've brought in, now you have more than 90% of the people with health care. You'd think that's good news, right? But a lot of the people who have come into it are people who never could get health care before. So they're people who had pre-existing conditions. They're people who are older. But when you look at 31 states who had the Medicaid expansion, half of them with Republican governors, and some of them Republican governors who were fighting for this. When you had 17% of the American people saying, yeah, let's change Obamacare, we like what they're doing, you know that there is something that's working right. There are going to have to be changes. There are going to have to be adjustments that are made. This was not it. And the doomsayers, I think, just as are pretty much in the same categories of people who say this is the end of the Trump presidency, which is also not true, but it was a very, very bad day.
When they look forward, they've got infrastructure, terrible name for new airports, new roads, new train tracks, new stuff around America, and a huge jobs program. They have tax reform. President keeps talking about the border wall.
And part of the problem with this is it just got a whole lot more complicated. This is a president who said so many times on the campaign trail, to great applause, winning is everything.
Yeah, I'm going to win so much.
And not just that I'm going to make a deal, I'm going to make beautiful deals. In fact, the finger pointing is exhausting. I can hardly explain to you the intensity of what was going on inside that White House this afternoon. So you have, obviously, the president saying it's the Democrats' fault. You have Republicans now who are tweeting and blaming their fellow Republicans, members of the Freedom Caucus. And then you have other members of the president's staff who are telling NBC News, by the way, the president never really wanted to make this the first thing ever. That was something that Reince Priebus and Paul Ryan and the vice president, Mike Pence, wanted to do. So you have all of this blame game going on. And the fact of the matter is, politics is about momentum. He lost big today. His approval ratings are at record lows. His travel ban has been blocked by the courts. General Flynn had to go away. There's still an active investigation about Russian influence on the election. How does he move to something like tax reform? And even senior staffers, before I left the White House this afternoon, Brian said to me, because of the financial impact the failure will have, this makes the tax reform much more difficult.
Kelly O'Donnell, is Paul Ryan in trouble as Speaker?
I don't get that sense at all tonight. I did feel like I was watching a movie that was recast, sitting in that same seat a few years ago when John Boehner was hobbled by this conservative faction within the House conference known as the Freedom Party, formerly the Tea Party. Now, there's a lot of principled people in that group. Not all of them are intransigent, but enough of them bond together and say they just won't compromise. And the art of compromising is part of what legislating is. And that's where Paul Ryan, a coded message in what he said. opposition to governing. That was a message aimed right at them. So he tried to be very careful to not lay blame at their feet, but there's a lot of frustration among Republicans who believe that that group who would not move really cost John Boehner his speakership, lifted up Paul Ryan, and now today hobbled Paul Ryan's ability to deliver. This should have been easy for Republicans with a little room to spare to do it on their own. I was struck today by the president being able to deflect, the art of deflection perhaps, a little lighter in his tone at times. Yes, he blamed the Democrats, but also talked about how great a bipartisan bill would be. They're going to come to me, we're going to get it done. He really moved on, also immediately talking about trade and other things he wants to do. A moment or two of acknowledging that he learned some lessons, and that was humbling, but also no rancor toward his fellow Republicans. And I think given the candidate we saw who would spare no wrath against fellow Republicans, note how calm he was against his fellow Republicans today. I think he was kind of taking some lessons in and breathing a bit.
And Robert Costa, before we let you put your phone away at long last, one more quick question. I saw the president said to a journalist today, enough already. It's been theorized he didn't own this. It's been reported he wasn't as angry about this as he was the Sessions recusal, as he was his inaugural crowds, as he was the handling of the travel ban.
That's a great point, Brian. I mean, I was struck immediately when I spoke to him that his tone was pretty even. His words were, and his whole phrasing was pretty muted. I said, do you regret not starting with taxes and infrastructure and something else? He said, no regrets. But then he said, which of course was revealing that he's glad he got this over with, that he was really never had the passion for health care that he does for hardline immigration policies, for trade, for national security issues. And this is a president who's, in a sense, being dragged along by a more ideological party and a congressional GOP that's just not Trump in style. It doesn't have the nationalism, the populism, the temperament that the president has. And so he wasn't furious. And people who've covered Trump for a long time, they know he can get furious in public and behind the scenes. Today, a more muted moment, disappointment, but he seems to be okay with moving forward on different fronts.
Robert Costa, Washington Post. Better than average, more exciting than average day for you, as it was our whole panel.
He's going to gain some Twitter followers.
For all of us,
Thank you. Thank you to all. And coming up after our first break, the new president, his signature legislation defeated, and a complete about-face today straight from the Oval Office. This is the 11th hour.
my first day, I'm going to ask Congress to send me a bill to immediately repeal and replace disastrous Obamacare. What's the first thing you're going to do? Well, we're going to work immediately on repealing Obamacare. On my first day in office, I am going to ask Congress to send me a bill to immediately repeal and replace, I just said it, Obamacare. My first day in office, I'm going to ask Congress to put a bill on my desk getting rid of this disastrous law and replacing it with reforms that expand choice, freedom, affordability. You're going to have such great health care at a tiny fraction of the cost, and it's going to be so easy.
Candidate Trump said over and over again, repealing and replacing Obamacare would be something for day one of his presidency. Keep that, what you just saw, in mind as you listen to what the president said today.
And I never said, I guess I'm here, 64 days? I never said repeal and replace Obamacare. You've all heard my speeches. I never said repeal it and replace it within 64 days. I have a long time.
Still with us, Chris Jansing here in our studios in New York. Also joining us, Charlie Sykes, host of the public radio program Indivisible and an MSNBC contributor, plus former RNC chairman, also an MSNBC political analyst, Michael Steele. Good to have you all here. And Michael, I'm coming for you because...
Don't do it.
Well, here's why. You did used to run this party. You're also a student of history and you're a patriot. So I was looking at some of the quotes I made contemporaneously today while the president was speaking from the Oval Office. It's not going to be pretty. It's getting much worse. This year should be much worse when it explodes, which it will soon. This is a room, and that is a desk, Michael, where presidents have exhorted us. They have gotten us back on our feet after terrorist attacks. They have sent us off to war. They have confessed some things. They have comforted us and got us through crises. Today, I've never heard quite the message we did today.
I'd agree with that, Brian. It was just really, first off, I thought it was interesting to have that staged in the Oval Office. That's something you do in the press briefing room. It's something you may do at some other location because that Oval Office is reserved for those big moments. For Donald Trump, I don't think he invested in this as a big moment. I think it has been reported and confirmed by various sources that he really wasn't all that into the health care piece. His instincts had him leading with tax reform. He got talked out of that. So his heart was never in this. And so to have that type of an exhortation from him to go charging up the hill on health care was something that I never thought would really be a part of his MO, because it just wasn't there from the beginning. His frustration, though, despite the kind word to Paul Ryan, is with the House, in the House leadership, because his attitude is likely, I let you lead with this, why couldn't you get it done? That is the consummate CEO perspective. You went out on point, you didn't deliver. Now I'm moving on. But again, to stage that in the Oval Office to me was kind of a stunning, different take on this whole thing, because it elevated it in a way that I don't think it was required to be elevated to.
Charlie Sykes, the Associated Press lead, which will be the most roundly distributed and repeated piece of journalism from today, times I don't know how many papers and websites around the world, is one sentence. Just 2 months in, Donald Trump's presidency is perilously adrift. You don't read that kind of writing often from the AP. Even Ryan said this makes tax reform tougher. Where do you see the agenda now, Charlie?
It is in jeopardy, and that's why a couple of nights ago I predicted, well, I assumed that they were going to be able to pass this, because the consequences to Trump's presidency are so grave. Look, you know, when Harry Truman sat at that desk, he said, the buck stops here, and I didn't see a president who thinks the buck stops there. I was actually struck by two things about that performance. Number one, Donald Trump looked relieved. He did not look angry. Right. And I think that's a tell that he's saying maybe this is the best thing that would happen. And the other really extraordinary thing, and Brian, I think you pointed this out, that after 7 years of railing and campaigning against Obamacare and saying what a disaster it would be, how quickly the Republicans and President Trump just folded on this. It's like, okay, never mind. This is a Republican House that voted more than 60 times to repeal Obamacare. They couldn't bring themselves to vote once on Trump care, and they're basically saying, yeah, well, never mind, we're going to move on, which is really, really extraordinary. And you do wonder whether or not he did have his heart in all of this, despite what he told the voters over and over and over again, that he did not have passion for this. He clearly did not have knowledge of this. And his admission to Bob Costa that, hey, who knew that politics was different than real estate deals? Really, who knew?
All the while, as many have pointed out, using the language of victimization, even though when you look at his comments, the victims here ultimately are the customers, the taxpayers, the American people. Chris Jansing, I want to talk about the learning curve between campaigning and president, and let's remember what the president said just a month ago.
Now, I have to tell you, it's an unbelievably complex subject. Nobody knew that health care could be so complicated.
Actually, as has been pointed out, a lot of people knew that health care could be so complicated.
And warned him that it was going to be complicated. And I asked, actually, a senior staff member, what did he learn? Because when the president said today, I thought it was a remarkable admission that he had learned some things. And he said, well, he learned a lot about loyalty, and he learned that for some people, nothing was ever going to be enough. And I think, yes, his heart maybe was never in it, but it got less and less in it as it went along, because he was having to give up some things to the conservative members of the Republican caucus that would directly go against all the things that he not only promised, but I think also believed in. And look, it wasn't as if he didn't at least put on a show, right? He was wining and dining people. He was taking them on Air Force One. He was bringing them to Mar-a-Lago. And even Mark Meadows from the Freedom Caucus said, look, he's a charming guy. And if this was about being charming or likable, he would have won this easily. The problem is that this is about policy. And the criticism you heard when I was in Congress this week was that he never did a deep dive. He never was really into the details of it. And so he never really found his way. And the interesting things, I'll pick up on what Charlie Sykes said, not only did the president seem relieved, but a number of staff members I talked to told me that essentially we're moving on. And there was not the kind of feeling that I got in the Obama White House when something went bad, that they really felt it deeply. In fact, one senior staff member, when I said, so what do you guys do next? Meaning, is it taxes? How do you recover from this? The answer was, I'm going to go home and spend a weekend with my kids. It's just this, it's a sort of a different feeling in that White House.
I've also heard them speculating if the boss will exhibit phone control over this coming weekend. We shall see. Chris Jansing, after a long day for you, thank you for joining our conversation. Another break. Our conversation continues as we look at this blame game, a fractured party, and two leaders unable to deliver the votes. The finger pointing, as Chris was saying, going on tonight in Washington when the 11th hour continues. We are back with our continuing coverage. Charlie Sykes and Michael Steele remain with us. Michael, Mr. Chairman, do you fear for the immediate future of this Republican Party? And second part, would you recognize your Republican Party if you ran into it in a dark alley?
I'd start with the second part first. No, I would not. I don't recognize it, and it continues to baffle me, the capitulation, the backing away from core principles, for what purpose I've yet to discover. So the party needs to get its act together on that front, particularly the leadership. As to the first part, the advice would be focus the mission. Don't rush. Part of the problem here was taking this health care into the rush mode created more problems than it was worth in the end. So settle down, work with the White House, develop a strategy on the key issues and policy you want to hit out of the park first, and go there. Play to strength, not to weakness.
Charlie Sykes, the president full-on blamed the Democrats. The truth is they didn't need one Democratic vote to pass this. Right. Do you fear for your friend and fellow Wisconsinite Speaker Paul Ryan?
Well, of course I do. I mean, this is a huge blow for him. And when you think about the Faustian bargain that Paul Ryan and other congressional Republicans have made with Donald Trump, think about what they have been willing to ignore or enable or empower, you know, hoping that they would get, well, the legislation that would be voted on today. So, you know, I am concerned because, you know, all of this was based on the expectation that if they just towed the line, they would get this legislation signed. And now I think that Paul Ryan's got to go back to the drawing board. I think that he's got to, you know, maybe, you know, go for smaller, you know, easier, lower-hanging fruit, but also realize that Donald Trump is not the great negotiator. He is not the closer, and he will not always have your back when he says he has your back.
And Charlie, in 15 seconds or less, do you buy into this legitimacy argument? Some people are talking about these investigations perhaps going to the heart of this administration. Do you have any fears on those lines?
Look, I think it's important to draw the line that whatever you think about Donald Trump's politics or policy, he is the legitimately elected president of the United States. And until the evidence is overwhelming, I think it's dangerous to engage in rhetoric that suggests that he is not legitimate.
Michael Steele, do you think the investigations speak to something perhaps existential?
We don't know yet, and I think that's part of the problem. Let's everybody go to separate quarters. I think a third party looking at this will help clarify a lot of this a lot quicker than having it in the political realm where it is right now.
Gentlemen, you've always helped us clarify things, especially at the end of this long day. Thank you both very much. Charlie Sykes, Michael Steele. Another break for us. Coming up, what's next? President Trump signals this move toward tax reform, but can the Republican majority find common ground on this when it couldn't unite on repeal and replace? This is the 11th hour.